Isana is standing by. So, Refuah, what exactly are you looking at in terms of the trends of consumer spending?
So, we spend, even in the toughest of times, okay? That is the gist of the story, Masako. But yes, that is a big story that we're focusing on this afternoon, in that 2 years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, an array of lockdowns and disruptions in various forms has resulted in extremely volatile spending behavior from consumers. Although the reality of job losses and economic pressure was anticipated, consumers remained resilient and continued to participate in the economy. We've got Isana Cordier, who is the head of consumer goods and services sector coverage at Absa, who joins me now to talk more about these consumer trends. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Isana. Maybe let's start with the overriding trend or patterns that you saw in consumer spending behavior in the period that you're reporting on.
Hi, Refuah. Yes, sure. Like you said, rightly so, it seems from our data, predominantly the card acquiring data, that consumers continued spending, and since we came out of lockdowns, spending actually has remained fairly high and kept increasing. However, we are looking at data now from a mobility point of view, and we have noticed that over the last 2 years, there has been a steady decline in footfall into malls that could point us to some depressing information coming on the consumer front. I could also just say that this correlates with some of the data we're seeing in our cash business, and that there is a steady decline in cash spending and money coming into the cash space, which also, as you know, is a big part of our economy in South Africa.
No, it absolutely is. And I find it very interesting, given the fact that we are dealing with higher inflation, for example. We've now got the advent of those geopolitical events that are happening in Europe, and consumers still remain resilient.
Yes, on the face value they do, but you've got to ask yourself where the resilience sits. Is it still at the top end, or is it at the lower end where we are starting to struggle? I would suspect that we are going to see a more depressed consumer coming and less spending coming through. In fact, some of our data now in April is showing a decrease in some of the big spending categories, including groceries, which is one of our biggest spending categories. So it's not conclusive, but it could be indicating to us tough times is lying ahead. Also, when you consider the impact of fuel prices that's still having to come through fully in the system, as well as pending interest rate hikes that we are anticipating in the near term.
And I'm glad you brought up the issue of categories, Isana, because I wanted to gauge from you, what are some of the biggest categories that consumers are still not compromising on in their spending habits?
Interestingly enough, clothing is holding firm, but as you could recall, during lockdowns, clothing was very hard hit, so people didn't really spend on clothing. I think as the economy is recovering, people are going back to malls shopping for clothing. However, health and beauty seems to be coming down quite significantly. Tourism has recovered somewhat, but again, knowing that the fuel prices is gone up significantly, I'm also not holding my breath that will continue.
No, absolutely. And then just a final thought from you, Isana. You did mention it very briefly about the outlook and the things that we're going to be anticipating over the next period. But in the medium to the longer term, the resilience of the South African consumer participating in the economy, is there a little bit of an optimistic outlook, or is it as bleak as you alluded to a little bit earlier?
I'm an optimist at heart, and I believe that we are a resilient nation. And under pressure, we always seem to bounce back and come back stronger. But I have to be realistic when I say to you that I do think in the near term, consumers are going to hold on to their money a little bit more tightly. And that's something that we as a corporate South Africa need to consider. There's going to be less of the pie, I think, to share. And the fight for the piece of the consumer's wallet is going to be harder. So yes, optimistic in the long term, but in the near term, I do think we're going to see some stress on the consumer.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's Isana Cordier, who's the head of Consumer Goods and Services Sector Coverage at Absa Corporate Investment Banking. Now.